Welcome back to Close Up. The Biden campaign has not wanted to repeat the general election mistakes Democrats made in 2016, so that means a lot of time invested in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Some of the Democrats who refocused on working class, Rust Belt-style voters saw their fortunes soar in the primary process, and one of them was Pete Buttigieg, who joins us for the Biden campaign this morning. Mayor Pete, welcome back to Close Up.
Thanks. Nice to be back with you.
So tell us, what's the closing argument right now for Joe Biden?
Well, it's simple. Joe Biden cares, and he's actually going to do something about the issues where the president has just been all talk, whether it's health care, whether it's looking after working families, or most importantly at the moment, actually dealing with this pandemic, conquering it instead of denying it. Look, we all want our lives back. We want our economy back. We want to be able to gather with our families and go to restaurants and ball games and all the things that come with American life. And that's never going to fully happen until we beat the virus. And that's never going to fully happen as long as you have a president who's in complete denial about the reality. So we've got to deal with that. And then we've got to make sure we have a president who actually cares about working families, not just tax cuts for the wealthy, but actually making sure all of us can get ahead. I think that's why in so many different parts of the country, we are seeing such strength in the coalition for Joe Biden. But we also know that, encouraging poll numbers are just poll numbers unless everybody gets out to the polls. And that's why it's so important that we're asking voters in New Hampshire and in every part of the country to be sure to have their voice heard at the ballot box.
Paint a picture for us. What does America look like after 4 more years of Donald Trump?
Well, I don't know that America could recover after 4 more years. There's no reason to think he'll suddenly become better at handling the pandemic. So that means more loss of life, and it means more severe economic damage. The wealthiest might still be okay. He's managed to take care of them no matter what. But for the rest of us, we're really going to be hurting. It's also 4 more years of this kind of chaos and division. Look, bringing the American people together is a huge task that no one person can do alone, but leadership matters. And if we have a president who gets up in the morning ready to divide America, as this president is, for his own political purposes, we're never going to get out of this. And I think so many of us are exhausted with the chaos and the division, not to mention the incompetence. 4 more years of that, and it's going to be rough at home and terrible abroad. There was a recent set of interviews of world leaders. For the first time ever, the head of the Chinese Communist Party commands more respect around the world than the president of the United States. If we allow that to continue, that's a security problem, not just a prestige problem. Those are just some of the things we could face if we have 4 more years of this. But the good news is we don't have to. The choice is up to the American people, and I believe the American people are going to make the right choice going into Election Day.
You proved the point of the importance of showing up in the primary. You put in the time, and voters here rewarded you for it. Is it problematic, do you think, that the nominee, Joe Biden, hasn't returned to New Hampshire, or is this just a fact of the math that there are states where the race is closer and that's where he wants to focus?
Well, the challenge, of course, is to have one candidate covering the entire United States of America. But I can tell you how important New Hampshire is to the Biden-Harris campaign, including, making sure that the campaign as a whole, surrogates like me, and as much as possible through whatever messages we can reach people with, getting those messages out from Joe Biden and Kamala, too. Look, New Hampshire is a swing state, and it's a state that famously thinks for itself. I felt that and saw that when I was on the ground campaigning, and that's one of the reasons why we're really urging Granite Staters to go to iwillvote.com/NH if you got any questions about how to check on your registration or know how to go through and vote, because every vote in every part of the country is going to make a big difference this year.
You spent a not insignificant amount of time in your campaign in the city of Claremont, New Hampshire, which could very easily be transported to Indiana or any other place in the Midwest, this quote-unquote Rust Belt towns. President Obama won Claremont twice, and then it went to Trump in 2016. The Trump campaign argues that those blue-collar voters have left the Democratic Party for good. Do you think Joe Biden can win them back? Obviously, you and Joe Biden both tried to win those folks back, but long-term, is that a problem for the party?
Well, I think it could be if we didn't reach out. But as you said, Joe Biden has been reaching out to families and voters like those in Claremont who remind me so much of my home in the industrial Midwest. And this president has only offered empty promises, fighting to take your health care away, delivering tax cuts for the wealthy, but putting services for the rest of us in danger, and breaking promise after promise in terms of the supposed economic benefits to working Americans that he said we were going to have. The only economic promise he's kept was the promise to cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations. It's true that Donald Trump did that, but I don't think that's what most people had in mind when they maybe changed parties and voted for him. And that's why we're seeing not only so many people who have generally been Democrats come back to the party, but a remarkable number, probably an unprecedented number of Republicans saying, look, I've always been a Republican, or maybe even saying I still am, but I'm not voting for this president. It's got to be Joe Biden this time.
One of the concerns I hear most frequently from voters is they say, gosh, I would like to vote for Joe Biden, but I'm so worried that he's going to have to shut the country down once again because of COVID-19. First, what if that's necessary? Is this country capable of doing something collectively like that now, as divided as we are? And second, what do you say to those people who are worried that their job, their way of life could disappear if we have to lock things up?
Well, lockdowns aren't happening because some politician thinks it's a good idea. When they happen, it's because the pandemic is out of control. The only way to end the lockdowns, end the economic pain, end the disruption, and end the loss of life is to deal with the virus. And that's something that is the only way to prevent those kinds of lockdowns. What you're going to see with Joe Biden in the White House is someone who is actually coordinating with governors, mayors, county officials, doctors, health officials, instead of this constant, deeply confusing and contradictory mixed message. You're not going to see Joe Biden say things are going along fine when we're putting up some of the worst numbers that the country has seen. We're not going to see the same kind of chest beating that you get from Donald Trump when the U.S. right now is posting the worst numbers, the worst response of any country in the developed world. This is no way to manage a mass casualty event like the one we're experiencing. And what all of us want is to get our lives back and put this pandemic behind us. The way to get that done is to end the virus.
We just had Donald Trump Jr. on, and he said that he wants to see all the votes that are cast by Election Day counted. Do you think we're going to see that same sentiment, though, from the White House this time next week?
You know, I really worry that President Trump, because he sees that he's behind in the polls, is going all in on a strategy of voter suppression. You look at pretty much every court case that the GOP has been around the country, and the one thing they all have in common is about making it harder to vote, or reducing the window of time when people can vote, or reducing the number of votes that will be counted. Now, the way I see it, and one of the reasons I speak to audiences, conservative, liberal, and in between, the way I see it is our job in politics is to convince voters. And if you're trying to suppress the vote or have some votes not be counted, basically means you've given up on the idea that you can actually persuade. It's an incredibly dangerous attitude for any party or any politician to take up. And it reflects real desperation on the part of the Trump White House. I think the American people won't let that happen. And I think our democracy is bigger than that. But it's not good for democracy when you see these kinds of tactics being deployed in all kinds of different parts of the U.S. And we should be ready for that all the way through Election Day.
All right, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, thanks for your time this morning on Close Up.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
All right, let's bring in John DeStaso to wrap things up for us. John, it's been kind of funny to see the same in-state Democrats here who always tell the tale of don't forget 2000 and the lesson of Al Gore, overlooking New Hampshire, never again. Now they're saying with such confidence, John, it doesn't seem like they need to campaign here, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. They've stuck up for their candidate. Where's the truth lie here?
Well, their polling is showing the same to a large degree that the public polling is showing. But there is a risk here. We all know that Joe Biden finished 5th in the primary. They are counting on the fact that even people who are not excited about Joe Biden per se are very enthusiastic about ousting Donald Trump. Recent polling that we reported just at the end of last week showed that most Biden supporters they're motivated primarily by wanting to remove Donald Trump from office, whereas most Trump supporters are motivated by their appreciation, some would say love, and their support for Donald Trump. So there's a big difference there, and I think that plays in Biden's favor. That may be the issue. Trump has always had trouble here in terms of his favorable ratings versus unfavorable ratings.
And Republicans have tried to make the argument that Biden's poor finish here in the primary is going to catch up to him somehow here in in this general election race. Do you see that punch landing at all?
Well, given the fact that there are very few undecideds, I don't think that will have a major factor. Going back to what I said, that most of the voters are going to be voting. Who are voting for Biden, more than half of them are voting. They would be voting pretty much for any Democratic candidate because they feel that strongly against Trump. We get down to the very end, we get down to a very close race. Certainly that point is being made by the Trump campaign that it needs to, it may come out. It may come out and it may have a factor. But right now, I just don't see it as being a major swing factor in the race here for the 4 electoral votes.
Yeah, it was a big collapse, but the one thing that Joe Biden has going for him here is that there wasn't a lot of ill will among Democrats, even though he didn't do too well here. John DeStaso, thanks so much. It'll be interesting to unpack all of this after the election is over.
Great. Thank you.